Last but not least, it is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Jonathan Barth, who is an assistant professor of history at Shippers.
Thank you very much. And as Mauricio said, I'm an assistant professor of history at Shippers, and my remarks are given from the perspective of a historian, but from my own particular historical analysis, and certainly you would be able to find many other historians who might have a different view. The election of Donald Trump, while surreal in many respects, should not have come as a surprise. This election, what we witnessed in this 2016 election, was a paradigm shift. This election was not about left versus right. That's not to say that left-wing politics and right-wing politics did not play a role. It certainly did. But a new paradigm won out. A paradigm that is new to our generation of politics, but in actuality is quite old. In fact, it dates back centuries. Elites versus ordinary people. The system, or establishment, versus the insurgent. This paradigm transcended left versus right in 2016, and we know it transcended left versus right because it manifested itself in both political parties. For many decades now, the United States has largely fallen under the rule of what some scholars and journalists call the deep state. The deep state, or shadow government, is a state within a state that exercises power, influence, and control over public policy, regardless of which political party is in nominal power. It includes elite Wall Street firms, the big banks, Silicon Valley, think tanks, the pharmaceutical companies, the military-industrial complex, the intelligence agencies, and a corporate media that's owned and controlled by a very tiny few. In recent years, Americans on both the left and the right have more and more awoken to the idea that Washington does not serve the people, that the government is no longer responsive to the people. In comes 2016, a new election. The pundits seem to think that a Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton match was inevitable, but to many Americans, such a contest was entirely unacceptable because both candidates, a Bush and a Clinton, represented in the most flagrant way the status quo. In the Democratic primary, the media, donors, and pundits worked strenuously to nominate Hillary Clinton. But a good percentage, a sizable percentage of the voters felt differently. Hillary faced a populist insurgent named Bernie Sanders, and Sanders railed against the deep state. His populist message was one of social democracy, and Hillary tried to mimic it, but for many Democratic, and especially millennial voters, her efforts were utterly unconvincing. Hillary won the nomination, but it was not the coronation that she had hoped for. In the Republican primary, the insurgent won, and he won against overwhelming odds. He faced mockery in the media, hostility from neoconservative leaders of his own party, primary opponents with far greater campaign cash, and let's be honest, he certainly put his own foot in his mouth on more than one occasion, right? Safe statement there. But he won the nomination. And he won as a populist. Trump's populism was very different from Sanders. One rooted not in social democracy, but in American nationalism. But in many other respects, Trump shared quite a bit in common with Sanders. And he positioned himself as a champion against the status quo. Rightly or wrongly, that's how he positioned himself. Well, the general election finally arrived, and I think finally, you can't understate that enough, right? The media and pundits roared from the television sets and newspaper pages, "You can't have him. You're not allowed to have him. He can't possibly win." I remember the day of the election, I checked Huffington Post, which I read on a daily basis, and they put the percentage, the chance of Hillary winning at 98%. 98%. And yet he won. It wasn't the first time that a populist candidate won the presidency. Andrew Jackson did in 1828, and again in 1832. And in fact, there are many apt comparisons between Trump and Jackson. William Jennings Bryan attempted a populist revolt in 1896, but failed to win a presidency primarily because he appealed only to farmers and not to working class labor. FDR ran a populist campaign in 1932. He won the election and revolutionized the political landscape for half a century. Since November 8th, 2016, Trump has made it clear that he fully intends to turn the entire system on its head. Again, for better or worse, I think he's made that quite evident. 4 questions yet remain. First, is he sincere about upending the deep state? Second, if he is sincere, is he even capable of doing something of that magnitude? Third, if he is sincere and if he is capable, is Trump's alternative preferable to the status quo of yesterday? Or will he transform a corrupt system into a far worse system, making us yearn for the days of old? The 4th question is this, and this will make perhaps a few people in the audience uncomfortable. But it's a question that has to be asked. What if he does a good job? Right? What if he does a great job? And again, I know that's uncomfortable for many people, lots of people. But what if that happens? What does that mean for the Democratic Party? What does that do for the Democratic Party in the future, and how do they adjust to something like that? Only time will tell the answer to these questions. But I suspect that by the next congressional election in 2018, we will have a pretty good idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. With no further ado, I'm going to give you, the audience, the possibility to engage in this conversation. Let me just remind you that, just to show you how cool we are at Shippers, we're live streaming this lecture here, and hopefully we'll get some questions from the viewers as well. So if you see Erica raising her hand, it's not because she has tons of questions of her own, but because she's trying to let me know that there are some live questions coming through Facebook. Okay.
Mr. Barth, you raised a very interesting question to your point. What would the effect be on the Democratic Party if President Trump is in fact successful? What would the effect be on the Republican Party? Because he certainly doesn't seem like a Republican, at least in a conservative sense. So if he effects this revolution, what will it do to the Republican establishment?
The question, can you all hear me? Yeah. The question was, what would a successful Trump presidency do for the Republican Party? My answer to that, I think you would, actually I think a lot of what Trump wants to do is not free market. And so the Republican Party is changing. You hear him talk about infrastructure projects, tariffs against foreign countries. And so, you know, and analysts have looked at what a Trump budget would look like, and it's quite high, right, as far as spending, government spending. And so I think the Republican Party would transform a bit into a working class, a bit more of an activist party on the economic front, not in the sense of redistributing wealth in the form of taxes, right? Because Trump's campaign on lowering taxes, but certainly an activist government and projects. That's a big change for the Republican Party. The Republican Party's been identified with free trade since the 1950s. As far as the Republican establishment, if Trump succeeds, that's going to be a big blow to the Republican establishment. That's why I would not be surprised if Paul Ryan gives Trump a run for his money in certain areas. Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell are in a rock and a hard place, because if Trump succeeds, that's a big blow to them. But if Trump fails, there's going to be a major sweep of Democrats into Congress. That's why I said by 2018, that's going to give us a lot of answers. If Trump does not deliver, then Democrats will be sitting very pretty. Because Trump, as I said in the talk, Trump roared against the status quo and so on. But now Trump is the man, right? And he's the one in power. And so if he doesn't deliver, he has nothing to. He has to deliver for him and the Republicans to succeed. So I think the Republican Party is in a very difficult place. The Democrats, if you're a Democrat, don't listen to all the dire warnings of the Democratic Party being done. That is certainly not true. But a lot rides on whether or not in these next 2 to 3 years the economy improves and whether or not he delivers jobs and the infrastructure projects, etc.
Thank you. I think I had this gentleman here first, and then go to you.
This one goes out to the historian. I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Professor Barth.
Professor Barth. Firstly, your beard game is so strong. So my question, I'm trying to not get too much onto the dystopian box and get things really scary. And I assume you might be more of an expert in this just by analyzing a lot of history. What do you think it will look like for someone to be able to say Trump is making violent steps or steps more towards larger wars? Because I mean, it seems to me when I look in the history books and I look at these guys during the Cold War, like they seem to be like taking whiskey shots and shaking hands, like it's the end of the world, talking about blowing each other up. Like I don't know what that looks like. What do you think will make you say, okay, that move, that statement, or that meeting was a more violent act?
The question was in regards to Trump's views on war and foreign policy, generally speaking, and that's a bit of an enigma, because on one hand, Trump has made it very clear that he wants to get along with Russia, and I think that is the biggest shift, foreign policy-wise, that we see right now. The last several years, we've seen a renewal of tension between the United States and Russia. Russia is a nuclear power, and Trump has made it quite clear that he intends to reset relations with Russia. And so I think risk of war with Russia has dramatically decreased. However, on Trump, you can't really call him a peace candidate because if you remember during his inaugural speech, he said we're going to eradicate ISIS from the face of the earth. That is quite an ambitious, right? How do you do that, right? So on one hand, you have a candidate who is essentially campaigning against war on one front, and on another front is saying that we need to be more aggressive. And I think everyone in this room would agree that there is that there are big problems in the Middle East. The big question is how do you deal with that? And frankly, one of the hallmarks of Trump is that he's not all that specific. Right? I think he does that intentionally. And so what will he do? It's very difficult to say. But he's made it clear that he does not believe, he's not a neoconservative. And the neoconservatives have run the Republican Party for several decades now. And, but just because he's not a neoconservative doesn't mean he's not going to be eager to go to a war, right? Or to, carpet bomb, a place just indiscriminately, which would have some very serious ramifications. So.
Thank you. Next up, Josh.
Yes, thanks. Question, I suppose, is for Professor Barth, and follows on your comments just a minute ago, but it could be answered by anyone on the panel. And that is, you set up these two insurgents as, in some ways, diametrically opposed, but sharing many things in common. But calling him a populist is I don't know, problematic maybe, but my question is, how can a billionaire who lives in a gold room at the top of the 50th story of a tower in New York be considered a populist? What role does class and social mobility play, or what role did it play in the election? What role does it play in civic religion or possibly philosophy in America today?
Great question. The question was for the Facebook Live folks, right? The question was, how can a billionaire claim a populist mantle? And going back to my own to history, Andrew Jackson, most historians accept as a quintessential American populist, right? Andrew Jackson was extremely wealthy, had a plantation of almost 200 slaves, a hermitage in Tennessee. But populism is more of a rhetoric and more of a language that is spoken that appeals to the hopes, the fears of the common people. And you occasionally will have insurgent, wealthy people who, the question is, are they sincere, right? The sincerity question is, and I think that's very much an open question here and in other cases as well. It's an open question with analyzing Andrew Jackson, right? How sincere was he when he appealed to common, Yowman farmers, in the West? So I think it's, you have to, yes, Trump is wealthy, very wealthy. So was Ross Perot, who ran as a populist in 1992. Actually, for a while, he was leading in the polls against the two major parties before he pulled out. And so really, I think in determining whether or not someone is a populist, you have to look at the language, the rhetoric, and who he's appealing, who he or she is appealing to, and who they are attacking. And Trump, in attacking the system, the establishment, I think qualifies him to be a populist. Again, the question is sincerity, and that's a very different question. But he ran as a populist, and regardless of luck, obviously it was quite effective. If you look at non-college educated voters, it's overwhelming. More than 2/3 of non-college educated whites voted for Trump. That's astounding. The Democrats used to have a hold on that vote. The Democrats lost that vote. And it's because Trump was effectively able to channel their concerns.
My question is for any and all of the panelists who wish to speak about it, and that is the future of truth in our society. Two aspects. One is, it appears that in recent years, I have seen falsehood being normalized in our society, predating the rise of the president. But let's say in this century, falsehood being normalized to an extent that I had not seen previously in my lifetime, except perhaps in recent years. And secondly, the institutions that we count on and that in the past have been effective in dealing with falsehood, for example, the press, and the First Amendment appear to be in a weakened state. So at a time when falsehood appears to be on the rise, the institutions that are there to protect us appear to be diminished. And so I'm concerned, being an academic institution here at the time, I would imagine them
more thing. I think we can't underestimate just how much the loss of faith that ordinary Americans have had in traditional media outlets and what role that plays in this world of it's difficult to know, right? Like what's true, where do you get truth, and so on. I came of political age at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, and one of my first experiences as a politically active person was watching one after another the media outlets telling us that there were WMDs in Iraq, right? By our definition today, that was fake news. And so I think this is no longer the 1950s or 1960s where you have a Walter Cronkite figure who goes on television on prime time and everyone just takes at face value what he says. And that is an uncomfortable world to be living in, right? Because it means that we're getting our news from different sources. And the internet has encouraged that, and what that means for the future of our political society here in the United States is still an open question.
Before I move to the next questions from the audience here, I'd like to move to, speaking of truth, to the digital audience. We have a question.
We have a question for Professor Barth. Given that the overwhelming majority of African Americans and Hispanic Americans did not vote for Trump, can we really characterize the Trump victory as one propelled by non-elitists?
Excellent question. And certainly when I spoke of a paradigm of elites versus ordinary people, that's perception, right? In politics, perception matters very greatly in a democracy, right? And so for Trump voters, they perceived him as representing ordinary people. For people who voted for Clinton, they did not see that. They either did not see that, or they believed he was representing the ordinary people of something that's ugly in American society. So it's all perception. If you look at the numbers of African Americans and Hispanics, Trump got 29% of the Hispanic vote. I think Romney got 27%, which was a bit higher than people anticipated. Why is that? I'm not sure. But if Trump wants to win re-election in 2020, the worst possible thing he could do would be to begin deporting undocumented immigrants. That would be such it would ensure his loss in 2020. If he does not do that and strikes some sort of deal where he constructs a wall or a fence in exchange for extending amnesty, or whatever term you want to use, it's not impossible that his numbers among Hispanics will either remain steady or go up. Among African Americans, Trump got 8% of the African American vote. That was higher, which is sad for Republicans, right? Very sad for Republicans. Republicans have ignored the African American community for decades. Trump got 8%, which is higher than his predecessors. 13% of black males voted for Trump. If Trump goes through with infrastructure projects and begins building up urban housing, as he says he will do, again, who knows if he will really do that. But if he does that in some of the worst predictions, that's why Democrats have to be very careful about predicting doomsday with Trump. Because if it doesn't happen, then that's going to make him look really good. If Trump delivers those things, because quite frankly, African Americans have been hurting for a very, very, very long time. The number of African Americans living below the poverty line is over 25%, which is astounding. The median income is $35,000. It's one of the lowest, in the country. And so conditions have not improved in the last several years. If Trump does something from a purely strategic standpoint to appeal to that sector, it may sound shocking to some people in the audience, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him pull as high as 20, 25% in 2020. But it depends on him. He has to do a lot because so again, so much of what we're talking about is speculation. That's the thing. We've never had such an unpredictable presidency, and so anyone who claims they have hard and fast answers is greatly mistaken.
I think we have 3 questions. We're going to go, I know, Michael, you have a second question. I'm going to go first with the 2 gentlemen sort of asking questions for the first time.
Yes, thank you. This question is mainly for Professors Barth and de Marneffe. The peaceful transition of power is often cited as like one of the hallmarks of our democracy. And yet, after the election, we saw an effort to stop normal democratic procedures like the Electoral College to prevent Trump from taking office. What kind of historical precedent is there for when those types of movements succeed? And how might we judge when they are right to do so?
I don't have that much more to add, except actually I thought it was a bit refreshing. The Electoral College is put into place as a safeguard against excess democracy. And so electors are perfectly within their right. Is it not on? No. Are we on?
It should be pretty.
Okay. Are we on? Okay. I'll repeat what I said. I thought it was a bit refreshing, actually, that we saw some of the, in respect to the electors voting various ways. I think in my U.S. history class to 1865, I always show for each presidential election, I pull up an electoral map, and it shows who won what. And future historians, when they teach the 2016 election, will the electoral map will show 7, 8 different names, including a Native American, and I'm not sure if that was the first Native American to receive an electoral vote or not. I'd have to look into that. But I think Elizabeth Warren got a vote, Ron Paul got a vote. But the Electoral College was put into place for a couple reasons, but one was to safeguard against excess democracy. Sort of the idea that we were based on a mixed government of a republic and with democratic institutions. And so, if an elector could not in good conscience vote a certain way, I say more power to them. And if you say you're not allowed to do that, then what's the point of having an electoral college to begin with? And as Peter de Marneffe pointed out, this is definitely a time of breaking norms. And should that surprise us that this is a time of norms changing? We're living in a revolutionary time period culturally. Right? We're living in the internet age, right? The digital age. Lots of things are changing all around us. As a historian, that's the other point. Anytime you have a major revolution in technology and communication, it is always followed by major shifts in society and politics. It's happened with the Gutenberg press. Just down the line with the rise of capitalism in the late 18th and 19th centuries, that brought about all sorts of changes in the political landscape. The internet's doing that as well, and so we should fully anticipate this is only the beginning of norm breaking. This will only continue, and so I would say we ought to get used to it. And I would say it's not a bad thing, right? Just have to see how things turn out. But I think I'm pretty optimistic about wherever things go out of this age that we live in, this digital revolution that we're living through. I think humans are going to come out on the other side of this. Far from a dystopic vision, I think we're going to come out on the other side of this, a free society, a free people. And what that looks like, there's no telling, right? But again, I would warn against doomsdayers. I'll leave it at that.
All right. I believe we have 2 more questions. Yes.
All right, so Donald Trump is talking about signing an executive order to ban Muslims from the Middle East and North Africa. So I guess to all 3 of you, I feel like this, to my
think Europe and the United States is in a very tricky situation here. Because as in the Western tradition, and this is actually relatively new in the Western tradition, let's not forget that it was only a few centuries ago that Europe was in Middle Ages, and the Islamic world was more liberal and more advanced than Europe was. In the last, since the Enlightenment, arguably since the Renaissance, the Western tradition has largely, with exceptions obviously, and with inconsistencies and contradictions, the Western tradition has trumpeted liberalism, and by liberalism I speak in a classical sense, rights, general freedoms to live your life as you see fit, as long as you're not hurting anybody else. And again, there are many inconsistencies that have taken place with regard to that. So we have a liberal society in which freedom of religion has been a very central cornerstone to where we have ended up. Europe went through over a century of massive civil wars between Catholics and Protestants. And the consensus that emerged out of that was that in a free society, you're permitted to pursue whatever religious beliefs you choose. And so we very much value that, and we are rightly so very much horrified by the idea of any judging someone based on a religion or faith. Where it becomes tricky, and I'm not sure where the answer is, and John alluded to this about how we have to have a secure, safe society. What's tricky is that for a great portion of the world, those liberal values are not shared, and where it becomes even more tricky is that there are a large percentage of people from the Middle East who do believe in freedom, who do yearn for the liberal values that we cherish. But there's a sizable percentage, and there's debate about how large that percentage is, that does not believe in that. In many of these countries, if you are gay, you are executed, thrown off buildings, literally. Women have very few rights. And so, how do you handle that? How do you deal with that? While still retaining your integrity, which we all want to do, and I would say we have to do, while retaining that integrity to the liberal values that we all cherish. And it's not an easy question. In fact, I think it's going to be one of the greatest challenges, and I think it's actually less pertinent to the United States. This is a European issue, I think, by and large, I'm not sure what you do.
All right, I think we have one more question, Michael.
Actually, this is an observation. First of all, thank you for this panel discussion. This is wonderful. But my observation actually, Mr. Barth, was in reaction to, in response to what you had said about your comments about the sort of deterioration, if you will, of media. I think this really speaks to the importance of developing critical thinking skills, analytical skills, being able to think for ourselves in a society, increasingly so. And what did the humanities do? We developed these skills, studying religious studies, philosophy, history. And never have they made anything more important than they are. So thank you very much.
And we didn't even have to pay him to say that.
Already paid.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending this first lecture. And please, thank you very much to all three participants for being here. And please stay tuned for round 2 of this great initiative. So thank you very much for coming.